All right, hello everyone. Um, so I am here at the North Carolina Museum of Art. We are going to be getting you guys ready for the AP exam. So the thing to kind of keep in mind is obviously we did a lot of art stuff in class, but art is a really big part of the AP exam. It's, you know, there's always going to be one or two questions about it on there. So I want to make sure that you have a good overview of everything of European art. I'm just going to go real quick through this, make sure that you have everything you need to know. If you have any questions throughout here, I see that one person's already logged in. If you have any questions, I can see the chat, so feel free to do that. You also need to make sure that if you have not printed out the worksheet from the Canvas class, it's the one that looks kind of like this at the top. It's got several different worksheets on there of art throughout the time of the course. I'm not going to be answering every question on that worksheet because I do want you to kind of go through and take some of the things I talk about today to sort of answer questions yourself. Also, there is a Google slide on the Canvas class, the review class, that I have uploaded with some of the artwork that is in this packet. Now, obviously, most of that artwork is not here. None of that is here. Most of that is European art that is elsewhere. But the packet does mention certain pieces of art, and it's a good idea that you get a sense of that. So I've put that Google Slides on the Canvas course as well for you guys. I hope you can hear me okay. It's kind of loud in here. There's a lot of people in here today. I know there's even a poetry slam going on, so we may encounter that. I don't know. That's why I've got my headphones on, so hopefully the microphone you can hear all right. So let's go ahead and get started. So I think it's important before we get into looking at the art itself, we need to kind of do a quick overview of the different periods of European history because they have a pretty big impact on that art. So I'm actually going to start us a little bit back before the class begins. We're going to start with the Middle Ages because one of the big things to understand about Renaissance art is how it's different from medieval art, right? So the thing to keep in mind when we're talking about medieval art is we are talking about things like the church, feudalism. This is also going to be the later Middle Ages especially, which does get a little bit into the course. We're seeing the rise of towns, the rise of the middle class, the burgeoning, like brand new, hey, middle class never existed before, and it's starting to exist now. So the medieval period, the church is going to be so central, right? Because that's central to that time. The next one that we have, of course, is the Renaissance, which is where our class really began. The Renaissance, we're moving away from the church and more to the glory of the human mind, right? So we're going to be seeing the depiction of the perfection of human form, the rise of the merchant class. This is also, the age of discovery, the rise of individualism. All of that is going on during the Renaissance. And of course, at the same time as the Renaissance, we have the Reformation. So the Reformation is the changing of the church, the beginning of, these new ideas on Christianity and God and people's belief or people's relationship with that belief. Christian humanism, the idea of a personal faith. This is also going to be the rise of the new nation states, right? Where instead of thinking of ourselves as part of a specific clan or a specific group, we're thinking of ourselves as Britain, France, Germany, or Holy Roman Empire, rather, in that time. So that's a big deal. Then as we move into the later 16th and 17th century, sorry, it's kind of a little, dropped my stuff there. We are seeing the rise of, these new monarchs like Henry VIII, the Louis in France, and Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. All of these really great, strong monarchs. That's also the period of the Dutch merchant class, right, where we see the Netherlands having escaped from Spanish rule, and now they're, doing their own republic there, the rise of the importance of the merchant class there. This is also going to be the age of the Glorious Revolution. England is going to, separate from the idea of the absolute monarch into a more constitutional monarchy. Then as we get out of the 17th century, we are seeing the rise of mercantilism, colonies around the world, getting into the 18th century, the dominance of aristocratic culture, the dominance of kind of the importance of the monarchy, until we get, of course, to the French Revolution, giving us the age of liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? And of course, as we talked about the French Revolution, it sort of goes back and forth. The importance of the Republic becomes big in there. Then as we get to the end of the 1800s, we're going to see this rise of nationalism throughout Europe, this idea of the Romantic period, where, of course, everybody is feeling a little nostalgic, feeling, you know, looking towards nature and that kind of thing. The late 19th century, we're getting the end of the Industrial Revolution, the importance of the bourgeoisie, middle class kind of thing, the quest for militarism and power throughout Europe. The era of imperialism is in that time period. And then, of course, World War I breaks out. And after World War I breaks out, people start questioning everything, start questioning, you know, why do we act the way that we do? Psychology becomes a much bigger deal. As psychology grows, depression, the idea of this post-war anxiety that we looked at, that sort of thing. And then at the end of World War II, we sort of see this like existential crisis with everybody in Europe, and they're starting to wonder, like, who am I? Why do we exist? What should we be doing? All of this good stuff. And then, of course, you know, there's the Cold War and communism and all of that. But the thing to keep in mind, the reason I give this whole sort of overview is that this is going to impact the art of the period, right? So as we go through these two kind of phases, or these different phases of art history, just kind of keep in mind the importance of culture and history impacting the art itself. So let's go ahead and go into our first exhibit. So like I said, we're going to start kind of before the class starts with medieval art. So let me turn us around here so you can see what we're looking at. So when you look around at this medieval art, you should notice that they have some things in common, mostly religious studies, right? Now, as we sort of talked about in class, medieval art doesn't have a whole lot of technique to it, right? It's just kind of figures on paper. One of the things that I also think is sort of important to note about Renaissance or medieval art is these little placards on the side here, right? What do you notice? Well, it doesn't tell you who painted them. That's because we don't know most of the paintings artists. They didn't really sign their work. That's not what's important. What's important instead is God, right? And that makes sense for the medieval church. So a lot of religious subjects, a lot of, you know, Virgin Marys and saints and kings worshiping saints, kings worshiping the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, a lot of Madonna and child, right? That's what we're going to see a lot of during medieval art. So, but again, the thing to kind of keep in mind is a lot of technique. Like, I love this one right here. This one's always been a favorite one of mine. Mary and Jesus are not proportional at all, right? And Jesus looks basically like a tiny human, right? So he's not really a baby, not really a child. He's just kind of tiny human being held by giant Mary, right? So that's medieval art, right? This kind of worship of God. The art itself is meant for the church, right? So like this right here, this is similar to what we would call like altarpieces, right? So the whole point of this is to go into a church and to show the glory of God. So when you look at your worksheet here, so this, again, this worksheet right here, it lists several different pieces. And the ones that are going to go towards the middle edges are tapestries. So things like the Bayeux Tapestry is a big one. The Richard II ribbage, which that's just another word for an altarpiece. Again, if you look at the Google slides, it's got pictures of all of these on there. And it'll be pretty clear to you guys why they are medieval art. Also the window at Chartres, which is a cathedral in France. In terms of the written work during this time period, during the medieval period, we've got works like El Cid, which is a story of chivalry written about a knight. We've got The Imitation of Christ, The Way of Courtly Love, or The Art of Courtly Love, I think is what it's called on there, and Summa Theological. These are mostly religious works. Summa Theological is, and then of course architecture is going to be castles and cathedrals. But as we move out of the Middle Ages and move into the Renaissance, the first thing that you will notice is that the work gets substantially better, right? So during this period, we have the addition of technique and form, right? So I'm going to bring you over here to this one. I love this one, but it's got a lot going on, right? So again, it is a religious painting. So during the Italian Renaissance especially, religious paintings are definitely going to exist. When you look at this, first of all, baby Jesus actually looks like a baby. He doesn't look like a miniature human. He is in proportion to Mary and the saint here. And if you look back in the background of this painting, right, we see that, there's stuff going on in that background. There are a lot of people in the background on horseback. You see perspective, right? That changes here. And if you look at the top, I really like this. It actually kind of looks like it's enclosed inside like a stable or something. But we see the use of perspective and color and, technique, studying the human anatomy. That's going to change. But these styles are also classical style. And when I say classical style, I'm thinking back to like the Greek and Roman periods, right? So if you look really carefully, you can see in the background, this doesn't look like the Middle East, right? Where Mary and Jesus would have been from. Instead, we're looking at, the rolling hills of Italy, right? There's going to be a lot of influences in this, in the way the Greeks kind of studied human anatomy. That's going to be a big part of this, again, focusing on human sort of ideas here. So on your worksheet, things like The Birth of Venus is one by Botticelli. Botticelli's a big name. In fact, this one right here that I showed you before, that is a Botticelli, right? So Botticelli is a big name in Renaissance art. Titian is another one. Da Vinci, Michelangelo. Speaking of which, there is The Last Judgment on there. The bust of Lorenzo Medici is another really big, important one. Of course, during the Renaissance, we also see the rise of portraiture, right? So we're seeing a lot more portraits being done in this period. So that's a big deal as we move into that direction. Literature of this period, obviously the Prince, the Courtier, the Decameron. These are all really important works. The architecture of the period is St. Peter's Basilica and Hampton Court, right? So we see this order, right? Evidence-based, human nature, that kind of thing. So as we are continuing to move through the Renaissance, as we know, the Renaissance moves north, and as it moves north into places like Germany and into places like the Netherlands, it starts to change a little, right? So over here, we're going to see these portraits of these two guys, man and woman, I should say. So they are merchant classes, right? So we're seeing that. Of course, religious work still does exist in the north, but again, it's slightly different. We're seeing sort of the aspects of like Gothic mysticism is there, right? Naturalism is sort of emphasized. So this is actually one of my favorite paintings in our Museum of Northern Renaissance work. So when you look at it, it should be pretty obvious the first thing you see, right? You see like the dead animals, all of this. This is, again, I told you there's a poetry slam going on, so don't worry about that. But this is a meat stall, right? But if you look in the background of this painting, can you tell who that is? That is the Virgin Mary and Joseph and Jesus. So the Holy Family is in this painting. But that's not what draws your eye, right? We see this realism of, life, right? And there's a lot of religious symbolism in this painting as well. That's important to note. But again, you can see how the style changes as it moves north. As we move into this period, things stay similar, okay? But it's going to get a little bigger, right? So this is the room that the poetry slam is happening in. So I'm gonna try and stay away from that so you guys can still hear me. So pardon me as I walk through. But I want you to kind of pay attention to this painting right here. Okay, so as you look at that, you can see it's bigger, it's bolder, right? It's still a religious theme, okay? But there's a lot more action and color to it, right? So also in this period, we see the rise of the Flemish, what we call the Dutch Baroque or the Dutch masters, right? So the Dutch masters, by the way, there's Philip II, or Philip III over there. Everybody say hi to King Philip. And Philip IV over here, hey Philip. But the Dutch, when we talk about the Dutch masters, they're going to focus on different things in their artwork. So we do see some religious themes, but we also see some daily life, right? So the Dutch up there, there's just a woman hanging out in a field, right? It's not about the huge religious scene anymore. It's not really about glorifying the rich anymore. It's now like, this is our normal life, right? A lot of still lifes in the Dutch Baroque or Flemish Baroque period. Again, this is the 1600s that you see on your worksheet there. Sorry. Just kind of looking around here, showing you some of these pieces. Of course, a big important artist during this piece or this period is Rembrandt. So we've got a lot of work that's from Rembrandt's kind of style in this art museum. Here's a stag hunt. This one I love, right? So it's a storm at sea. You can see how they play with the color in this one. Again, a lot of the let's show daily life off, right? So one over here that I am particularly fond of is the dentist, right? Yay, well, I love this guy right here. You can tell he's Catholic because he's praying with his rosary beads, but he's about to get a tooth pulled. His wife looks too happy to see this tooth go. Notice that. And of course, we've just got some maids and some ladies at a fireside. But again, a lot of really cool detail in this. So the art on your worksheet, we're going to see the cloth guild, right? So these are a bunch of just Dutch merchants sitting around a table. The allegory of the blessing of peace, the view of Delft, right? The bust of Louis XVI. We're also, in terms of literature, we've got Don Quixote, Les Cid, Misanthrope by Molière, which is a French play, Paradise Lost, which is an epic English poem. Versailles and St. Paul's in London are two sort of architectural marvels of this period. This period is really about showing the control of humanity over their own destiny and the triumph of the human experience, right? So we're seeing, less focus on God, right, and more focus on man. And that's really what we move away from in the 16th century. So in terms of the art of this period, we're moving away or moving towards a universal man, away from God, away from religion, more towards a worldly or secular view of art. Sort of man's imperfection is a big part of this one, right? So I think you can see sort of the changes that takes in that period from the Middle Ages to the 1600s. And it's a slow evolution, but it's pretty obvious, I think, when you look at it. So now we are jumping to our next worksheet here. Give me just a second while I get organized. And you may actually have two of the same worksheet in your packet if you printed it off early. But now we are on the one that says European art from the 1600s to 1789. And so we start with three pieces of art, or three styles of art: the Baroque, the Rococo, and the Neoclassical, right? So just some descriptions of Baroque, right? Start with that one. So we start with very sensual art, large scale, right? As you can see, even the paintings are bigger, but when I say large scale, I also mean there's a lot more going on. It's more dramatic, right? It's very elaborate. There's a lot more movement. You can almost say it's a little bit more restless. You can kind of see that in this picture. There's a lot going on in this picture. Very ornate, very emotional, but Baroque is still religious for the most part, especially the Italian Baroque period. So you might remember men like Bernini and Caravaggio that we talked about in class, playing with light and shadow. This one does a good job of showing that, those different styles that we're talking about here. So the first two on number 2, Bernini and Pozzo, are both Baroque artists, okay? But again, the Baroque style is very big, very grand. Again, a lot of light and shadow is played with that. You can see it again in this particular painting. But I think that that's important to keep in mind. And again, still mostly religious, especially in Italy and Spain, those Catholic countries, right? That makes sense. Here's another really, really good Baroque that I want to show you. Does a good light and shadow. Now this is the Denial of St. Peter. So this is St. Peter over right here, which was one of the disciples of Christ. But I think it's really interesting when you look at this painting, you'll notice that they are not in the clothing of the ancient world. They are in the clothing of the 1600s, which I think is really interesting to point out. So after Baroque, we move into Rococo. So if you remember, Rococo is the very pastel colors, right? Much more aristocratic, decorative, a lot of pageantry. Sometimes even it's like a dream life, right? It's like, oh, I'm just living in this dream world sort of thing. Very artificial, dainty, frivolous, delicate. These are all great words to describe it. So these are not perfect Rococo styles. In fact, this one here I think can be considered a combination of maybe Rococo and neoclassical, but it's got a lot of those Rococo features in it. First of all, the colors are lighter, right? Especially when you think about the Baroque ones over there, that dark colors versus these lighter pinks and blues. You see a lot of gold in this painting. Gold is like major Rococo. A lot of Rococo paintings are going to show rich people, right? So there's a lot of portraits of rich people in them. But then, as I said, this also has some elements of the neoclassical period, namely the, growth of Roman and Greek culture, which you see in this painting. So neoclassical is almost trying to show the perfection of man, or the perfectibility of man, humanity, nature and natural laws. This one's very much influenced by the Enlightenment, right? It's very classical, very clean, right? I think this is a really good example of neoclassical here. So this is the eruption of Vesuvius, right? So you see, first of all, because it's that neoclassical, or it's that classical period, right? So it's, ancient Rome. And this idea of natural laws, there are people dying in this picture. Some people are escaping, so you can see people escaping down here at the bottom. There's a lot going on, but the lines are still very clean. Nature is winning out in this picture, right? And I think that that's important to note as we are going through this. Neoclassical also has a lot of influences from the French Revolution. So Republic is valued in the neoclassical period. You can kind of see it in this painting right here. It looks very like photograph-like almost, the way this painting is done. But like the influence of this big church right here, that is a neoclassical building. So it's stuck in the painting, so it's literally neoclassical, right? So that's great. So again, at the bottom of that worksheet, the first two are Baroque. Newman and Fraguin, I can't say that. I'll let Maria fix that one in post. But C and D are Rococo, and E and F are both neoclassical. The next page, the one that says 3 styles of art, I'm not going to give you the answers to that. The art is on the PowerPoint slide, so you can go to that to figure those answers out. So you can go ahead and change now to the changing styles of modern European painting. So that's this worksheet. And this is as we are getting into the 19th and 20th century. A lot of things are changing in European art, and a lot of it has to do with, the time period that it's in. So we start with Romanticism. So the goal of Romanticism is really to break with that neoclassical period, right? So this, there's this idea of nature that plays in neoclassical or romantic art. So this is a good one, right? So we've got, our people just kind of hanging out and doing their own thing, right? This idea of Middle Ages nostalgia. You see again some more classical themes in this. The idea of heroes and faraway places, right? These are all very romantic style. Now, again, I'm showing you some more Rococo style here. Like this is pretty Rococo. We don't have a lot of romantic styles in our museum here. But think about like Liberty Leading the People is a one we talked about in class by Delacroix. We see Turner or J.W. Turner is another romantic painter, which is the founding of Carthage. It's one that he did. You might remember the guy standing on the cliff, the wanderer over a sea of fog. Nature is much more important in that painting than humanity is, right? So that's one we see there. So that's romantic. Again, break with neoclassical. It's very traditional. It's very much about nature. A lot of that nostalgia, that Middle Ages feel, hero, faraway places. The next one that we have is realism. So realism is really a very cynical style of artwork in many ways. It's very much opposed to romantic style of art. But realism is all about showing daily people at their daily lives, ordinary people at their daily lives. This is a great example. In fact, Jean-Francois Millet is a very famous neoclassical painter. This one is called Peasant Spreading Manure, right? Think about how different that is from some of this other artwork. There's nothing big, nothing grand. I mean, it's literally a guy in crap, right? But we're showing how peasants live, and that's a really big deal, right? And if you think about the titles of a lot of realist work, I mean, we're looking at titles called like The Gleaners, which are, peasant women picking up wheat. The Stonebreakers, these are manual labor, right? So that's a really great example of realism that we have here in our museum. Then we move into one of my favorite styles of artwork, which is Impressionism. So Impressionism was seen as a pretty radical thing at its time. It is a French style of artwork, so that's important to do. And a lot of Impressionist painters would go paint outside, not in a studio. It's called in plein air, right? And what these guys wanted to kind of portray in their artwork was a glimpse or an impression of what you could see at that moment, right? And a lot of Impressionist work, when you look at it, you can see that the brush strokes are not clean, right? Like this is a great example right here. When you stand further away from it, you get a good picture of what it is, but like the closer you get to it, it just kind of looks like brush strokes, right? So we have a couple Monets in our art museum. Monet is a really big name in art, in Impressionism art. And this is a great one right here. It's one of my favorites. But a couple more. He painted a lot of these cliffs here. It's a pretty famous work. But the idea of Impressionism is that it's, again, it's kind of blurry, right? In many ways, it's very dreamlike, but it's just, this is a glance or an impression of your daily life, right? It's meant to sort of be the reaction of the artist to a scene that they're in, right? They're not trying to say anything with an Impressionist painting. It's just, nature, gardens, right? Cliffs, water. They're not really trying to make a statement. That changes, however, with post-impressionism. So post-impressionism often looks very similar to impressionism, right? So this is kind of post-impressionist here, but what you'll notice is it's a little bit more abstract, right? And a lot of times it's really trying to move beyond what the impressionists were doing, and it's really trying to show almost the psychological aspect of the human mind. In many ways, it's kind of realistic. Now, obviously, the colors and the style, it's not going to look like a photograph. Van Gogh is a great impressionist artist. It doesn't look like a photograph, but he's showing real things, right? Van Gogh did a lot of paintings of like wheat fields, still lifes of flowers. They didn't, they used bright colors and things like that. But, so here's another similar one here. It's still realism, right? So that's post-impressionism. Now, the rest of these on here, we don't have great examples of in our museum. So I'm just gonna tell you about them, okay? The next is expressionism. So expressionism gets its idea for it being an expression of emotion, right? The painting is meant to show you or portray an emotion of some kind, right? A great example of this one is Edvard Munich's The Scream, right? So that's the one of like the guy with like, with all the bright colors in the background. It's not necessarily considered to be realistic. It's in many ways kind of an abstract sort of thing. But the idea is emotion is what's an expressionist painting. Matisse is another really great name for expressionism. Munich, like I said before, but expressionism, it started in Germany, right? And it started really just like before World War I. So it's kind of interesting to think about the time period that it's placed in. Then we move into Cubism. So Cubism is the one that's geometric patterns, right? Think Picasso, okay? So making the human form in shapes that don't seem normal, right? And a lot of these, the idea of Cubism becomes really popular after World War I because it's a period when things are not normal, right? And then last but not least on this worksheet, we have Surrealism. So Surrealism is just, it's the wacky stuff, right? Salvador Dali, that's our surrealist guy. It's meant to be influenced by Freudian psychology, right? It's a very fantasy sort of thing. It doesn't really mean anything. A lot of people try to put a lot of meaning in surrealist paintings, but they don't really have meaning. They're just kind of there, kind of meant to represent kind of what your brain just firing off random things, right? So again, I'm not going to give you the answers to the back. You can look at the works on the PowerPoint. But again, this was a lot of artwork to go through and to be able to see on the exam to understand why it's, why the art from those periods exists, what it means for people. So make sure you can recognize the different ones. Again, check out the PowerPoint that I've put on the Canvas class. I also uploaded a bunch of videos that go more in depth into some of this artwork that you might want to check out that playlist. But again, happy studying for your exam. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thanks for spending the afternoon with me at the North Carolina Museum of Art. Have a good one. Bye-bye.